Hi, we'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar, Employer's Guide to Handling COVID-19. Today we're going to be discussing all of the questions that employers have on what to do and what not to do and how to protect their employees and their business throughout this pandemic. Just a couple of housekeeping things. If you're new to GoToWebinar, you can change the audio mode that you're using. You can call in by telephone or speaker. You can minimize the panel with that orange button on the top left. We will be taking questions. So if you have any questions that you'd like to see answered, feel free to type them into that questions field. At the end, we're going to have a couple minutes for a Q&A. If we don't get to them, we're going to send the answers to the questions to you afterwards. So feel free, even if there's not enough time, to go ahead and ask those. So today we have Henry Rinder, who will be moderating the panel. Henry is a licensed certified public accountant in New York and New Jersey with more than 30 years of public accounting experience. We also have Ted Dudek, who is the president and managing member of Smolin, who's also a licensed certified public accountant in New Jersey and has more than 35 years of experience in public accounting. And we also have with us today Luke Breslin from Jackson Lewis. Luke is an associate in the Berkeley Heights and Monmouth County, New Jersey offices, and his practice focuses on representing employers in workplace law matters. So now I will hand things over to Henry.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you very much. I'm going to cut right to the program. Because as we all know, this is only 30 minutes and time is precious, and we got excellent co-panelists, Ted and Luke, who have been dealing with the issues we're about to discuss for the last 2 weeks on a daily basis. So there's a lot of information that we can decipher from this presentation and from these panelists. Our agenda will will include basically issues involving employment under the current circumstances. And the employment, obviously, issues that come up is termination of employees, layoffs, furloughs, family medical leave, and similar type of issues and concerns. And when we deal with it, obviously, we rely on somebody like Luke for counsel because these are complex legal areas that, from perspective of an employer, we need to get legal advice in making decisions in this area. So. If we could go to the next slide, Amanda, I would turn over to Luke to describe the Furlough versus Reduction of Force and maybe Emergency Family Leave Act as well.
Okay, thank you, Henry, Ted, and Amanda. My name is Luke Breslin. As Amanda said, I'm an attorney at Jackson Lewis in New Jersey, and as you might imagine, given that we're an employment law firm representing management side employers, we've been very deep into the COVID-19 related issues and the employment of employees and how the new laws that have been passed both on the federal and state levels are affecting employers on a daily basis. So as Henry indicated, just kind of by way of background here, there's some concepts that we'll be discussing today that many of you may or may not have come into or had to address in the last few weeks. But generally, many employers these days are left with no options but to reduce their staff at this time, given the lack of business and the lack of work for many folks in light of many of the stay-at-home orders and other government directives that are affecting companies' abilities to continue to operate at either a reduced capacity or no capacity at all. So generally, a reduction of force is a long-term layoff and break in employment with some general or specific intent to reinstate. A furlough, conversely, is a short-term layoff with technically no break in employment, with a definitive but estimated return to work expectation. During a period of furlough, an employee continues to be an employee of the company, and they are entitled to health insurance, likely entitled to health insurance. I should mention that if you intend to furlough any employees, be sure to review your summary plan documents to ensure that that furlough does not affect employees' eligibility for benefits. So those are the general concepts that we'll be discussing throughout the presentation today. So keep those in mind. And again, as indicated by Amanda, we're happy to answer any questions you might have that we're not able to get to today. So moving on to the next slide. As many of you likely are aware, back in, this is probably the middle of March now, the US government signed, or President Trump signed, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And the two primary provisions of that are an Emergency Family Medical Leave Act portion and an Emergency Paid Sick Leave portion of that act. These are benefits that are in addition to any company provided benefits and relate to specific reasons that employees need leave because of, resulting from the coronavirus. So first, with the Emergency Family Medical Leave Act, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the regular Family Medical Leave Act, which provides up to 12 weeks of leave for employees if they're qualifying, if they're have qualifying reasons. Under this, the FMLA provides up to 12 weeks of leave to be used if an employee cannot work because the employee's he or she has to care for a child because the schools are closed or the child care provider is unavailable during this time. So just understand that the FMLA leave time only relates to care. There's only one reason they can use it, is for caring for children whose schools are closed or child care provider is not available. So the first 2 weeks of the FMLA are unpaid, but weeks 3 through 12 are paid at 2/3 of the employee's regular rate of pay. There's a cap of $200 a day and $10,000 in the aggregate. During the first 2 weeks that are unpaid under the FMLA, the employee may elect to use any accrued vacation personal time under existing company policy or the emergency paid sick leave time that we'll touch on in a minute. As I mentioned, this is in addition to existing leave provided by the company. The company cannot force an employee to use the accrued paid time during the first 2 week period. That would be an option for the employee. And as I mentioned, it does not diminish the right to leave under state law. So here in New Jersey, we have the earned sick leave law. This is in addition to that. So keep that in mind. So if we can move on to the next slide. So as I mentioned, the other aspect of the FFCRA, the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, is the emergency paid sick leave. And I should say, let me back up, that the FFCRA applies to companies with 500 or less employees. So if you have more than 500 employees, this likely does not apply to you. There are certain tests used to calculate, whether two related entities should be counted together. So keep that in mind, that if you do have various related entities, there are tests to use to determine whether or not you're subject to the requirements of the FFCRA. So back to the emergency paid sick leave portion of the FFCRA. Again, this is for all employees of the covered employer with 500 or less employees. And there's no durational requirement prior to taking the leave. So with respect to the EFMLA, an employee, in order to be eligible, the employee must have been employed for 30 days prior to the needed leave. Under the PSLA, employee, if they started last week, they'd be entitled to the time under this aspect of the FFCRA. And the paid sick leave under this is up to 80 hours of paid sick time for full-time employees, in addition to any paid sick leave already provided. And this is paid sick leave at the employee's regular rate with some restrictions, which I'll touch on in a minute. So we can move on. So under the EPSL leave, these are the various reasons that employees can use the time or can take leave. And obviously they all relate to coronavirus. The various reasons are for the employee's own illness, if they are inflicted with COVID-19 or have to quarantine because they're suspected to have it, they can take the leave. But they can also take leave if they're caring for an individual who needs to quarantine, isolate, or self-quarantine under a government order, which the regulations that have been released do clarify that a government self-quarantine under government order does include these stay-at-home orders, like in New Jersey we have, but they clarified that if you are subject to a stay-at-home order, you would not be entitled to the leave if you can still telework and do work. It's just if you're but for the order, you can't go to work. That's when this would be, an employee would be entitled to leave if they're subject to that type of order. But if they can do work, they would not be entitled to the leave. And as I mentioned, reason 5, which is on the second column, the top bullet, can be used for, employees can take leave under the FMLA, which I first touched on, as well as the PSL. So they can use this, if this applies to them, they can get leave under the FMLA and PSLA as well. But all other reasons for this leave only apply to the first 2 weeks, the up to 80 hours of paid sick leave. So that is the Family First Coronavirus Response Act. There's a lot more information. We just don't have the time today to go into super detail on it. But again, we're happy to answer any additional questions you have. But keep in mind that if you're 500 employees or less, you'd be subject to these requirements, and employees would be eligible to take this leave to the extent they qualify. Moving on.
Teddy, I know you had many questions for Luke as we were entertaining different options for Smolin. So could you address some of those key questions that we had to counsel on?
Sure, Henry, thank you. Luke, so perhaps as an employer, you can define for me like the treatment of a salary employee versus an hourly employee, with both when you have a reduction in force and with furloughs.
Yeah, absolutely. So a common question we've been getting is, number one, can you furlough employees? Well, the answer would be yes, and that's if you're exempt or non-exempt, meaning salaried or paid hourly, you certainly can lay them off or furlough them. You can also reduce their hours to the extent they're an hourly non-exempt employee, and you can also reduce the salary of any exempt employee. So I think we have a couple slides on these points a little bit further on if we want to move to them so the attendees can see the specific language, and I can explain that in a little bit more detail. I think it's the next one. So as I mentioned, the question, can I require non-exempt employees to work for the same hours for less wages? Yes, you can reduce their hourly rate. That's no problem, so long as you comply with minimum wage requirements in your respective state and any kind of collective bargaining, employment contract requirements. So take into account any additional requirements you may be subject to in addition to standard minimum wage requirements. But you can certainly reduce their hourly rate. You can also reduce the number of hours they're expected to work. So some employees working 40 hours a week, and you only have enough work for them for 20 hours a week, you can certainly reduce them to that 20 hours, and you just pay them for the hours actually worked. There's no need to pay them any additional monies. So long as you're complying with unemployment, you just pay that non-exempt employees for the hours that they actually spent working. One thing to keep in mind, if you do change an employee's rate of pay, and this applies to exempt and non-exempt employees in New Jersey, the Department of Labor suggests, it says requires on this slide, it's really just a suggestion and guidance, their expectation that you provide at least one pay period notice. So keep that in mind if you are planning for a reduction in salary or a reduction in hours or rate of pay, I should say. as to non-exempt employees, can you require them to telework? Yes, you can require them to work at home as well. Just keep in mind that you need to have strict compliance with payment for all hours that they actually work. So you have to have timekeeping measures in place. A telework policy is a good idea in practice. I know practically speaking now it's difficult with lack of time and planning, but something to keep in mind as well. And if we could just go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, for exempt employees, yes, can you reduce their pay as well? And the answer to that is yes. For salaried employees, it's a little bit more tricky. Number one, you can reduce their salary, but you need to make sure that you're paying them at least $684 a week. If you don't pay them $684 a week, then you would be losing the exemption to be a salaried or exempt employee, where they wouldn't be subject to overtime requirements. So make sure that if you reduce their salary of an exempt employee, it stays above $684 per week. If you do, if you do reduce salary or furlough an exempt employee, you should you need to pay them for the entire week, regardless of how much they worked. So, if an employee works on Monday and you decide to furlough them, you need to pay them for that entire week, subject to certain exemptions, but generally that is the rule. But the next week, when they don't perform any work, you don't have to pay them. So in order to maintain the exemption on the salary basis test, you got to pay an exempt employee for the entire weekly pay if they perform any work. Changes in pay must be prospective. You should not do that very frequently because it could create issues with the exemption as well and the overtime requirements. Another option with respect to exempt employees, if you understand, that obviously, business needs are much less these days for many companies. So an option is to convert them a non-exempt employee, it should say exempt to non-exempt. That's probably not a recommended approach, but understand it is an option. If you do that, we wouldn't recommend you do it more than once or maybe twice in a year, but it's really not the best approach. The better approach for exempt employees would be to reduce their salary, but practically speaking, you shouldn't make any express promises about reductions in hours as well, because for exempt employees, salary is not directly correlated with number of hours worked, at least under the law. So we understand that many salaried employees who just are subject to a reduction in pay would probably work less hours, but just be careful in communicating them to them. Don't expressly promise they're going to only work X number of hours during this time period. So, I don't know if you have any other questions on that issue.
The issue I see that perhaps you could sort of highlight for the audience the exempt definition versus non-exempt definition, so everybody understands.
Sure. Yeah.
What groups of employees we are discussing here.
Yep. So an exempt employee. So let's just back up. So obviously, if you're a non-exempt employee, you're paid on an hourly basis, and you're entitled to pay for each hour that you work up to 40 hours, and once you reach 40 hours, you're entitled to 1.5 times your regular rate for each hour worked. So that's a non-exempt employee. Typically, non-exempt employees, are they're not going to be the president of the company. There may be more entry-level positions oftentimes, but obviously that's not a standard rule, but it's just something to keep in mind. And then for exempt employees are not subject to overtime requirements. So exempt employees are expected to work as many hours as is necessary, and they'll get the same salary for every week throughout that year, subject to certain exceptions. In order to qualify as an exempt employee, there are certain requirements. Number one, you have to get paid the salary basis, $684 a week, but then there's certain qualifiers. There's 5 exemptions to be an exempt employee. There's an administrative exemption, higher there's a sales exemption. So there's various exemptions to keep in mind, but you need to satisfy the test, a duties test. So employees would need to perform certain higher level duties and sometimes have higher degrees or education to satisfy the exemption. So that's basically the difference between exempt and non-exempt employees.
Ted,
so Luke, I have a question, Luke, on what would be the difference between a salary reduction and a furlough?
So a furlough, as I kind of mentioned at the outset, is essentially a temporary layoff. So the employee is not entitled, or excuse me, not going to be performing any work. And in fact, they're not permitted to perform any work, and they shouldn't be, answering emails, answering text messages at all. So they're not working. Technically, they're still an employee of the company, but they're not working. It's another word would be a temporary layoff. And a reduction in hours or reduction in salary is just that. So the employee who's an hourly employee, non-exempt employee, works 40 hours a week or 35 hours a week. Right now, business is half of what it was, so you put them at, now they're working 20 hours a week. And for a salary, same thing. If someone is making $100,000 and business, doesn't allow for you to continue to pay that, you can reduce it by whatever percentage you like, whatever makes sense for your business. So you can reduce it by 50%, and that person getting paid $50,000 for that temporary period of time. Once that, once the business needs allow for you to return them to full pay, you would, and then you make a communication to them that this is a temporary reduction for a period of time. And as business needs allow, we will return you to your regular hours or regular salary. So that's kind of the difference between those two concepts.
So is it safe to assume that if you reduce the pay, you should not tie that to hours worked?
Yes, that's
if you're a salary person.
Yes, if you're an exempt employee and you reduce someone's salary, say by 50%, that shouldn't be directly tied to a reduction in the working hours either. I understand, practically speaking, that's probably going to happen because business needs don't require them to work at 100% capacity. But just in terms of the FLSA, the Fair Labor Standards Act, and these exemptions, in order to ensure that they maintain these exemptions, and then they wouldn't be required, you won't be required to pay them overtime. They have to, you're paid a salary, and you need to work as much as necessary. So you shouldn't tie salary directly to number of hours worked. I understand that, practically speaking, has that implication oftentimes, but just be careful of any communications. Don't directly tie reduction in salary to reduction in days worked or hours worked.
Okay.
Look, we hear from clients that some employees who, basically stay at home right now are asking to be basically laid off so they can collect unemployment, because they think that unemployment benefits right now might be higher than what the company is paying them. Is that true, that some employees could actually get higher amount of unemployment than wages?
Yeah, it could. And if we could go to, we'll go to slide, I'm not sure what it is, but the unemployment benefits, I think it'll be helpful for the audience. So as many of you are likely aware, a couple weeks ago, President Trump signed the CARES Act. It's called the Coronavirus. The words are escaping me at this moment, but we call it the CARES Act. And there's 4 separate sections in the CARES Act, but one of them relates to unemployment benefits and emergency unemployment benefits that are provided under the Act. And that piece of it allows for employees, to the extent they're eligible for unemployment benefits in their respective state, they'd be entitled to an additional $600. So if an employee is entitled to $1 of unemployment benefits, only $1, they'd be entitled to this $600. So they just need to qualify for unemployment benefits in their respective state, and then they're entitled to the $600 benefit at the federal level. this $600 benefit is per week. It's going to be running through July 13th, I believe is the exact date. Like I said, employees who qualify for unemployment in their respective states would be entitled to that. There's also another piece of the CARES Act that extends unemployment for 13 weeks. So in New Jersey, employees can get up to 26 weeks of unemployment. Now that's going to be 39 weeks with the additional 13 weeks. So just quickly on New Jersey unemployment, under New Jersey traditional unemployment, the weekly benefit rate is capped based upon minimum wage. The maximum weekly benefit rate in New Jersey for 2020 is $7.13. And you calculate, you arrive at the weekly benefit rate by taking 60% of average weekly earned during a base year up to the maximum. So you just calculate their employees' weekly pay, times that by 60%, and typically, again, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but that would be your weekly benefit rate, and then that would be a max of $7.13. There's also partial unemployment. That's if an employee's salary or hours are reduced by 50%, that employee may be eligible for partial unemployment. Again, you use the same calculation, deduct the pay that they're actually getting paid, and the 50% of pay or 50% of hours from the calculation. Again, these are all subject to a caveat that the decisions are all made by unemployment in the respective state. So there's certain eligibility issues that could arise, but these are kind of the general framework and rules for unemployment. And if you could just go to the next slide, the audience can see an example to Henry's question about making more. Yes, this is an example. It's 24 hours, $24 a week, working 40 hours. That's $960 a week. They can earn $576 as their weekly benefit rate plus the $600. So they're making $1,176 on unemployment, as opposed to $960 when they were actually working. As I said, there's eligibility issues that could arise, and again, it's all determined by the state's unemployment offices, but there's also a credit for employees with certain dependents that could add to your weekly benefit rate as well. So that's kind of an overview about unemployment and the new CARES Act and the rich benefits it provides. Yes.
Yeah. Luke, I have a question. If someone is collecting unemployment benefits, as the employer, am I still obligated to cover them in our health care plan?
So that would depend. If an employee is laid off completely, that would be a qualifying event under ERISA, and the employees would be, then you need to provide them a COBRA notice, and they wouldn't be eligible for the plan. To the extent you decide to furlough an employee, a temporary layoff, like I said earlier, they're still technically an employee of the company, and subject to the language of your summary plan description, they may be entitled to continue to receive benefits as a qualifying employee. Sometimes there's limits, so you can furlough somebody for a period of 60 days and they can still be an active employee under the plan, at which time they would be ineligible, and then COBRA notices would be required to be sent out. To the extent you reduce hours or salary, they may be entitled or eligible for health coverage as well. Again, it's governed by the summary plan description. If someone's hours are reduced, if a qualifying employee must work 30 hours under your plan and they're reduced to 20 hours, they may not be eligible. I will say a lot of states are waiving those requirements. So definitely consult with your state to see what they're doing as to benefits, because many insurers are adjusting their plans so that to account for these situations and allow employees to stay on coverage during a furlough or a reduction in force or reduction in pay or hours. So.
Amanda, we have a minute left. Perhaps we could take a question from the audience. Amanda?
Yes, hi. So sorry about that. I was still on mute. Yeah, we had a bunch of questions come through, and some of these questions were more related to what happens if someone gets COVID. So related to, if someone does get it, who are they responsible for telling, and how much can they say?
Okay. Yeah, this is obviously a common question that's been coming up, and our general advice and counsel on positive cases are, coordinate with your local Department of Health, notify the Department of Health that somebody has tested positive. You should keep that employee, that should immediately remove that person from the work site, from the office or other place of business. Then at that point, work with the local Department of Health to determine the source of the employee's exposure. You should, to the extent that employee came in close contact with other employees, you may want to notify, you likely should notify those employees that they may have come in close contact with a positive case, but there are confidentiality obligations. Do not disclose the positive test employee's name to the other employees. That's would be run afoul with the Americans with Disabilities Act. There is some guidance that you can provide more information to local health authorities, but that would be also subject to the confidentiality obligation. So it's really you provide as little information as is necessary to address the situation. So you remove the employee from the workforce, you coordinate with local health, you notify any other employees who may have come in close contact with, subject to confidentiality obligations. It's recommended you disinfect the entire office, maybe shut down for a while, bring in a third-party agency to clean the entire building to the extent you have concerns that it was widespread in the office or place of business. The employees, other employees may be required to, if they came in close contact with them, the circumstances require them to self-quarantine for a period of 14 days. Certainly the employee who was positive is going to be subject to those quarantine obligations. And then there's return to work protocols that need to be followed in terms of clearing certain employees to return to work, whether or not they were tested positive or they were just suspected of being positive tests. So there are certain return to work obligations you should keep in mind.
Luke and Teddy, we are coming to a conclusion of the webinar. I wanted to thank you both for joining us today. This is a very interesting and hot topic under the circumstances. Amanda, thank you for hosting it. And I wanted to thank our listeners and viewers for attending this webinar. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.